I'm having trouble because I have 2 sermons to preach, and I'm afraid I'm going to do it. The first one has to do with the gospel, because we have in Mark was particularly interested in showing Jesus as an exorcist. We heard that he cast out demons last week. He's casting out demons this week. He's going out into all of Galilee, where he's going to cast out some more, along with healing the sick. And sooner or later in the gospel, he sends out the disciples 2 by 2 and gives them power to heal the sick and to cast out demons. Now, if we read it as a fairy tale, we'd have no problem at all with the idea of demons. But if we really settle ourselves for a minute and think about Christians in the 21st century, how much on a day-by-day basis do you think about casting out demons? Not too much, really. That's because you're Episcopalians. I guarantee you there's some other churches around town that are very interested in casting out demons, and they see them everywhere, which is a problem. They're not really everywhere. Now, I am not going to be so skeptical or scientific-minded that I say there are none, but I would say they are seldom seen. And that often those who want to play in the realm of casting out demons and fighting spiritual warfare are really more focused on Satan than they are on Christ. They want to demonstrate the power they have. And anybody that looks kind of bad or a little bit evil or has some kind of mental illness or has some kind of orientation that doesn't match up with their ethics is possessed by a demon, and they want to set them down and cast it out. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I've seen it, and I've been there. The problem with that is that most of the time there is no demon present, and what they're doing is shaming the person for not being how they ought to be in the person who's exorcising them's eyes. If you look at the Catholic tradition, there certainly are rites of exorcism. There is a process for doing it. It's even mentioned in our own prayer book, but never to be done without consulting one's bishop. And in the case of the Catholic Church, they have, of course, a very elaborate bureaucratic process for deciding if there is a demon and then how to deal with it. So this idea that they're everywhere in all kinds of people and that my job is to go out and find them and cast them out is really a misappropriation of Christ's ministry. Now, were there demons in his time that he was casting out? It appears so. Now let's think about what a demon might have looked like. The one last week was one who the guy was all shaking and everything, and Jesus, without having proclaimed anything about himself, he points to Jesus and says, "I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." And it says it again in this. They knew who he was. They were spiritual beings, and therefore they recognized the Messiah for who he was. Now that makes it a little bit iffy and a head scratcher. The evil demons are able to recognize who Christ is, and the regular people can't. They've got an advantage. The problem is they misuse their advantage. I probably only saw in my lifetime one person that made me think this person might be possessed. It was in my second position as a priest. I was the assistant rector of Trinity Church in Galveston, Texas. And we had a lot of homeless people who migrated to the end of the interstate and were in Galveston. And they showed up at our office regularly looking for all kinds of help and assistance and money and so forth. But one day, this gentleman showed up and he brought in another fellow, and it was my turn to take him. They came into my office. I had my back to the window and my desk in front of me, and they came in the door and sat down in the chairs I had, and the fellow started saying, I think he's really in danger. The devil has been telling him to kill himself. And I looked at this fellow, and it scared me. One of the very few times I've ever been fearful around a homeless person. I see them all the time in places I go in Loveland and particular locations, and have contact with homeless people. And often they're mentally ill. And you can tell whether they've been taking their medication or not. When they've been taking their medication, you can have a fairly reasonable conversation with them. I can ask, how are you doing? What do you need? What's going on? And so forth. When they're not, the eyes are pointing two different directions and spinning, and the words coming out make no sense whatsoever. Mental illness is real. Schizophrenia, particularly, is real and present often among the homeless. And that's why they are. Now, there are certain principles and ideas about what causes this, and certain medications that have been developed that help to reduce the voices in their heads and to help them be more cogent. But sometimes they just look crazy. And you have to know the difference, and you have to know how to be with them depending on how that is. Now, I don't doubt that schizophrenia has been part of the human experience forever. And certainly in the time of Jesus, lacking all of our psychiatric and psychological studies and modern medicinal remedies, that a schizophrenic that was full out psychotic looked demonic. And this fellow in my office looked demonic and was talking about the devil and wanted to do violence to himself. And I thought I should have my desk in a different orientation so I can get to my door. That's how fearful I was. And that was the sign to me that there's something different about this guy than most of the homeless that I deal with. The fear that I felt was a signal. This is where I transition to the second sermon. I was able to sense something in him. And I will tell you that I didn't do an exorcism in my office. I helped the fellow get him back into the car, got them directed to the psychiatric unit at John Seeley Hospital that was very close by. And I never heard another word. I don't know what happened from there. I hope he found the help he needed. My response in that moment was simply this. I was there doing my job, what I was called to do. I wasn't like Paul. I didn't do it for free. I made a living at it. But if you look at the second part of Paul's message in his letter, listen to this. I am free, but I've made myself a slave to all, that I might win some, or even many, not all, I have become a slave to all, but I'm only going to win some of that all. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. Pretty easy for Paul. He was raised in all ways as a law-abiding Jew and a Pharisee. And in order to win Jews, to those under the law, to the Jews who were very observant of the laws as they understood them, he observed those laws and so as to not offend them in any way. To those who were outside the law, regardless of whether they were good people or bad people, Paul followed his inner consciousness and his conscience so that he obeyed God's law as he understood it. In other words, he maintained an ethical and moral stance, but he didn't link that to the formal Jewish law. And so to those outside the law, he became one outside the law. Didn't worry about what they were eating or not eating and what they might offer him at their table. He just was gracious, we might say. To the weak, he became weak. I become all things to all people that I might by all means save some. And this is the most direct description of empathy you might find in Paul's writings. His ability to be with any kind of person, whatever they might be, in order that they might encounter in him the loving Christ who he believed had saved them. Already saved them. They just needed to know it and be able to respond to it. Now, in the book of Joy that I used when I did the women's quiet day some time ago, one of the things that was said in that book that I found very interesting is to say empathy is not enough. Because empathy just means I recognize in you what you're feeling or what you're experiencing. I can even feel that myself. I can find my own places of response to your distress. But what they said, I forget, it was probably the Dalai Lama said, but compassion is more than that. It is empathy combined with action and response. You see, I can empathize all I want to somebody who's homeless or mentally ill or in distress or weak or needy or whatever, and I can say, oh, I know how that feels, and then turn away and walk away and make no response. Compassion is empathizing, seeing how someone is, recognizing what their need might be, and then responding and attempting to meet that need as I am able. Now, there's some people who aren't empathetic at all. And if you've ever been around one of those people, as a Christian, they're very annoying. They're really annoying when they're in a pew proclaiming themselves to be a Christian. But they have no empathy or understanding or sympathy for someone who hasn't succeeded like they have, who isn't righteous like they are, who isn't a churchgoer, who isn't disciplined and making money and holding a job and having just one marriage and kids that all get honors. Anybody who's not like that, there's something wrong with those people. They just need to pull them up by their bootstraps. They need to get some discipline. They need to be like me. And then they would be just fine. Boy, I'm exaggerating only a little bit. Some of the conversations I've had with people in the pews and in vestries through the years. no empathy whatsoever for someone whose circumstances, beginning at birth, have made everything about their life programmed towards failure and distress and bad behaviors and addictions and on and on and on I could go. For someone like that to turn their life around, they don't need that person I just described. That person has no use and no message, no gospel, no good news for that person. Because they can't relate. They don't even want to relate. They only want everybody else to relate to them. The mental illness is described as narcissism. Everything's about me, and you're all here to serve me. There's even some clergy like that. I don't want to name names, but it's an illness. And it's a dangerous illness because narcissists can be very attractive and very seductive while they're drawing you in and making you promises. But it's all so that you will serve their needs, never the opposite. So the opposite of compassion is narcissism. The opposite of narcissism is compassion, in which I put myself aside, my own accomplishments, my own disciplines, my own mental categories of thought, and to sit with someone who is so different than me that the only response is either to just shrug my shoulders and walk away or to enter into a deep curiosity. Curiosity is the way towards compassion. That is to say, tell me about yourself. Now, this scary guy in my office, he told me enough that I just wanted him out of my office and me through a door where I could run. Seriously. I did not want to empathize very far with where that man was, because it was a deep spiritual distress filled with self-loathing, with the promise of violence. And I responded in the only way I knew how in that moment, which was send him to somebody else who might figure out what to do. And sometimes that's the right thing. So I look at Paul, and I look at how he said, I've been called to present the gospel. And I can either do it out of my own will, and I know what it's like when I'm operating in ministry out of my own will and trying to make things happen the way I want them to happen, to control people, to cast out demons, to exorcise evil from the community, to make everybody do things like I think they should be done. And I know what it's like when I surrender myself to the commission I've been given to serve. Now I want to say, as much as clergy get put on pedestals and as much as we get to stand on pedestals and behind platforms and wear fancy stuff and silk and satin, it's all wonderful. But it is really no greater or no less than whatever God has called you to. This is just what God called me to. And we're the 1%. You're the 99%. Therefore, God has lots of other calls and commissions and things for people to do for the sake of the gospel without pay. Except for this: the joy of seeing good news light some poor, despairing, weak, distressed, mentally ill, homeless, whatever person see some hope. To hear perhaps God really does love me. I'll end with this. The story was told to me of a fellow who was doing what many of us did when we were in cities and there were big hospitals and before HIPAA, and you could go in and see the list of people and what their denominations were, and you could go visit the Episcopalians. And I did that, you know. But so this fellow was doing that, making just these sort of cold calls, you might say, in hospital rooms. Walks into a woman's room and has a sort of a difficult conversation. She's not very forthcoming. She looks sort of agitated and irritated that the chaplain has shown up in her room. And so this visit's not very long, but as he's going out, he says, "Well, I just want you to know that God loves you." She turned to him and said, "Well, you love me, and I'll decide for myself whether or not God loves me." Ooh. Ooh. What a challenge. What a prophetic word was spoken to that person in that moment. If we can't see and find sympathy, that is just feeling sorry for somebody else's pain, and empathy, meaning I can identify that pain in myself. I don't need to feel or take on their pain into me. That's unhealthy boundaries, let me say. But to recognize it and to find that place in myself where I have felt those things. But then to also say, is there anything I can do to help you in this moment? Whether it's a prayer, a 20, some food, a meal, directions to a place where they can find the help they need. When we act like that, we, like Paul, have become Christ-like, willing to exhaust our own resources so that we might save some. It is a profound calling, and each of you have some part to play in that gospel gift. Some Spirit-given gift. Not your own will, not your own what you learned at school, but something more profound. Something like the demons that gives you the capacity to see Christ, but not in Jesus, but in the suffering person in front of you. When you have found a relationship with the Spirit that allows you to see Christ in the most obnoxious, scary, unfit, mentally ill, morally corrupt, when you can see Christ in that person, then you have achieved spiritual maturity. If you cannot yet, at least admit it. That's okay. If you can just admit it and say, honestly, I don't want to be around anybody like that. I don't want to see people who fail. I don't like people who are morally corrupt. They just make me angry and I don't want to be around them. Well, if you can at least say that, at least you're starting with truth. But don't justify it. Say, I've got some spiritual work to do to get to that place where when people see me, they might get a glimpse of Jesus.